Thank you for joining us today for a conversation at the CNAS annual conference on the U.S. domestic terrorism threat environment and the transnational connections between groups that are engaged in domestic terrorism and domestic violent extremism. I'm Carrie Cordero, a senior fellow here at the Center for a New American Security. There is a long history in the U.S. of activities and ideologies that in today's lexicon goes by a few different descriptors. You'll hear me and the expert guests that I'm going to bring into the conversation in a few minutes discuss issues of domestic terrorism or politically motivated violence that's intended to intimidate populations and affect the politics and governments of particular countries. Something called REMVE, which is racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism. IMVE, or ideologically motivated violent extremism. And then there are also groups that we think about in the domestic violent extremist realm that are anti-government or anti-establishment motivated violent extremism. In a few minutes, we're going to be joined by two additional experts on Canadian government national security. But first, I am thrilled to welcome to the CNAS annual conference Nick Rasmussen, who has a distinguished career in public service. Nick, welcome.
Thanks, Carrie. It's great to be here today.
Nick, I just want to give our audience a little bit of background on Nick's substantial history of public service. He currently serves in government as the DHS Counterterrorism Coordinator Task Force Director. In this new capacity, he reports to the Secretary of Homeland Security and is the department's most senior official charged with coordinating counterterrorism activities. Prior to his service at DHS, Nick previously had over 25 years of service in the U.S. government, including as the National Counterterrorism Center Director, NCTC Director, and served in posts across political administrations, including as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Counterterrorism at the National Security Council, and also as Director of NCTC appointed by President Obama and continued into the Trump administration. Outside of government, he was also the inaugural Executive Director of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which is a nonprofit organization charged with preventing terrorists from exploiting the online environment, in addition to a number of academic posts. So the country is grateful that Nick Rasmussen is back in public service. And Nick, thanks so much for being here with us today to help us understand and unpack first what is the actual U.S. domestic threat landscape right now from a counterterrorism perspective, both domestic and international. And then I'd like us to talk a little bit about how that fits into the bigger global picture, which I know will be of interest to our CNAS audience. So with that, to start off our conversation, Nick, can you tell me where you're in your new role at DHS as the counterterrorism coordinator? Give us a little bit of a comparison to when you were serving as NCTC director. How has the domestic terrorism landscape changed since your service or in the last decade or so?
It's a great question, Carrie. And again, thank you for the kind welcome and introduction. I really do appreciate it. Your question is spot on. I would point to a pretty significant change in that last 3 to 5 to 7 years, the period of coverage that you're talking about, with the domestic extremism, domestic violent extremism, and domestic terrorism set of threats, I would argue, gaining preeminence in terms of our overall set of concerns related to homeland terrorism threats here in the United States. Again, if we had been talking 4 or 5 years ago, we certainly were not immune to those kinds of plots, those kinds of attacks, those kinds of incidents, but they were not at the front of our mind because we were dealing with a very, very significant set of terrorism threats tied to overseas foreign terrorist organizations or the ideologies or grievance narratives of our more traditional terrorist group adversaries. That, I wouldn't say that we've lost the latter and gained the former, but I think the balance has shifted pretty dramatically. If you think about the threat environment we face today, it's the domestic extremism set of threats that are greater in volume, in frequency, and even lethality in the current environment, and that's a source of deep concern.
So let's talk about a recent example and a new bulletin that recently was put out. There was a new DHS National Terrorism Advisory System bulletin, and maybe you can tell our audience a little bit about what the purpose of those is and who it goes out to. But it was released just a couple weeks ago, May 24th, and it mentioned that the Allen, Texas shooter, so just to give a frame of reference, because these types of shootings happen so often, but Allen, Texas was in May, and that was at the Outlet Mall in Allen, Texas. And the bulletin said that shooter had REMVE, or racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism ideologies. How are you and your colleagues in government thinking and assessing these REMVE motivations in connection with the proliferation of U.S. mass shootings?
So I'll start, Carrie, by answering your question about the actual vehicle we use to communicate the information you just described. Periodically, DHS issues these NTAS bulletins, and they're exactly as advertised. They're for the purpose of informing the public about how we, the department, and we, our intelligence community partners across the U.S. system, view the threat landscape here in the United States. And we've got, right now, we issue them on a 6-month basis. And so the last one was shortly before the holiday period last winter, and then we issued this one in May. And what we pointed to basically, Carrie, was a persistent threat environment in which individuals or small groups of individuals mostly attached to a domestic violent extremist narrative of one sort or another are our most significant threat that we face right now. And this DVE, domestic violent extremist threat population that I'm referring to, can be broken down further into various strands, one of those being, of course, what you just described, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists. And there you would think of the string of attacks we've seen in recent years that have targeted either the Jewish American population or the African American population or the Asian American Pacific Islander community, or any of the different attacks where the underlying motive included, perhaps not exclusively, but included a grievance narrative or something based in racial hatred or discrimination. And that is unfortunately increasingly a feature of the threat landscape that we are seeing here in the United States. And to jump ahead to where I know you're taking the conversation eventually, it's got a transnational piece to it as well. So
before we get to the transnational piece, and we're going to bring in our international partners as well, as we get into that aspect of things, Nick, tell me a little bit, when you were at NCTC, information sharing was a key component of what that organization was created to do.
Absolutely.
An enormous amount of developing a legal framework, developing policies, developing international partnerships, developing interagency coordination mechanisms, all in relation to international terrorism, was developed and honed and professionalized and really became a efficient and well-oiled machine over the course of the last 20 years. What do you see as the information sharing environment as it relates to domestic terrorism or domestic violent extremism? Because it seems to me it presents different challenges, different entities that are involved. How are you in your DHS capacity seeing the evolution of that information sharing environment?
I think you're onto something there, Carrie, because I think it took a lot of time, effort, and energy, but between DHS, NCTC, FBI, I thought we arrived at a pretty good place over the years in terms of creating a sharing relationship with our state and local partners around the country, making sure that we could share with those partners contextualized intelligence information that would allow states, municipalities, big cities to make decisions about their own security, or to receive the kinds of warning and information that would allow them to take necessary protective steps. Internationally, we did the same in terms of creating an architecture for sharing information really, really broadly across the globe, and not just with our closest partners, but with an even wider array of partners around the globe. The domestic terrorism challenge, though, I think flips the dynamic a little bit in that I think we certainly at the federal level don't have all of the available information that would give us insight as to who are the individuals that may engage in the kinds of attacks that we were talking about just a minute ago. It's just as likely, in my judgment, it's just as likely now that an individual who is potentially an offender or an attacker of the sort that we were talking about a minute ago might come to the attention of a local community or local law enforcement before they would come to the attention of federal law enforcement authorities. So I certainly think that the information sharing challenge is harder than ever because it needs to be much more of a two-way conversation than it perhaps was in the early years after 9/11.
And so our international partners that in the past, again, the conversation has primarily been focused on international terrorism of the Al-Qaeda and ISIS and their progeny related. Are they now, as we widen the lens to sort of bring in this transnational aspect of things and the global coordination on it, are our international partners, our Five Eyes partners, now becoming more interested and engaged in working with you and your colleagues in the federal government as it relates to what we would describe as domestic violent extremist groups?
The short answer is yes. Whereas I think, again, hearkening back to 4 or 5 years ago when I was director of the NCTC, I would sit down with a set of foreign counterparts, and this particular topic that we're talking about would not have featured in our conversation, or it might have been mentioned purely in passing. Now I would argue it is, if not the number one issue on the agenda, it is certainly front and center on the agenda. And it's because of what I alluded to a couple of minutes ago. The underlying ideology, grievance narrative, whatever you want to call it, that animates some of these domestic violent extremists, particularly the racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, that underlying ideology or belief system is not geographically limited to the United States. It can be found in lots of different countries around the world. Some of the same conspiracy theories, some of the same, as I say, narratives that point to, for example, great replacement theory or the white race somehow being supplanted in its preeminence. These are not unique to America or to the United States. Our friends abroad are seeing these as well, and it just heightens the requirement or creates an imperative for us to do more information sharing with our partners as we confront these issues.
Nick, one last, just to follow up on that before we bring in the rest of our panel here. Do you, when you were talking with our friends and allies around the world, our partners in information sharing and intelligence gathering, do they perceive that much of the radicalization or the inspiration, do they perceive it as coming from the United States? Or is this sort of generally recognized as each country having its own variation or issue of it? Is the U.S. sort of viewed as proliferating radicalization of individuals and extremist groups abroad?
Well, I guess I'll just say this. One of the unfortunate realities of this particular slice of the terrorism and violent extremism problem is that individuals who carry out these horrific attacks become sources of inspiration for other people around the globe who share the same belief system. And I would argue that too often these individuals are Americans who've carried out these horrific attacks, some of which I alluded to earlier, and then their names, their belief systems show up in the writings or utterances of attackers who engage in that kind of activity overseas. So I don't want to put a number on it or anything. I can't quantify it, but unfortunately it happens far too often where Americans or people in the United States who've carried out these horrific events or attacks do serve as inspiration and contribute to radicalization in other parts of the world.
Thanks for that. Okay, I want to bring in Nick. Thanks for that overview and that introduction to how the U.S. and our partners are thinking about these issues. I want to now bring into the conversation two of our Canadian government experts and Canadian national security experts. So we will be joined here by Leslie Soper, who is the Director General for National Security Policy at Public Safety Canada. For our audience, that is an organization similar to our Department of Homeland Security. Leslie Soper is responsible for community-wide policy development on a wide range of national security issues in Canada, including transparency and review, research security, lawful access, and tools to counter violent extremism. And she has spent her entire career working in the area of security and intelligence policy, border law enforcement, and migration. So Leslie, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm going to come back to you in 1 second. I want to first also introduce to our viewers Professor Stephanie Carvin, who is a professor of international relations at Carleton University. Her research interests are in the area of international and national security and technology, and she is the author of a new book called Stand on Guard, Reassessing Threats to Canada's National Security. She also has prior Canadian government experience as a practitioner and as an intelligence analyst. So Stephanie, welcome to the CNES annual conference as well. Leslie Soper, I want to bring you into the conversation. Nick Rasmussen was just describing sort of how the U.S. just in the last few years has, I won't say shifted, but definitely expanded its attention to domestic violent extremism and these groups. On your side of the border, what are the steps and policies that Canada's public safety is taking to address these similar types of issues that you are seeing?
Thank you for having me here. I think there's a number of places I'd want to start on that. Canada's been very aware of what we term ideologically motivated violent extremism as being a predominant form of violent extremism occurring within the Canadian landscape. Just a bit of background, since 2014, we've had attacks that have killed 26 people, wounded 46 others in 7 separate events that we would term IMVE. So this has been a top of mind issue within our political environment. And there's been a lot of thinking over the last, I would say the last 5 to 6 years about how do we disambiguate the types of trends that we're seeing in this environment. And to put a fine point on what are we talking about when we say ideologically motivated violent extremism, we're really talking about people who are motivated in whole or in part by xenophobia, racism, anti-authority sentiment, violent misogyny, anti-LGBTQ ideologies. But it's really, what we've come to understand about this particular outlook is that it can be drawing from a wide range of grievances and ideas from across political spectrum. And it's animated, of course, by technology and to our discussion today, it's transnationalism is driven by communities of understanding that go on in the internet spaces. That could be driven by, online gaming environments to, YouTube channels to, many other commons where like-minded individuals gather and exchange ideas. So to Nick's point, I think we've been looking at, how we look at questions about so-called lone wolfism. How do we look at how individuals are being galvanized by other international events, so the Christchurch events, or our own events in Canada, London anti-Islamic attack, the mosque attack in Quebec City, as good examples. How these become events that then further propel ideologically driven individuals to engage in further acts. So just to land on your point, what are we doing? I think our Parliament has recently studied the issue in great detail, has brought forward 33 recommendations, everything from a social health focused approach to prevention through to ways we can better collaborate domestically with law enforcement and across transnational boundaries to improve, the interdicting, identifying early, putting in place the right prevention mechanisms. No surprise, in the Canadian context, people see this issue strongly linked with how do we better manage the internet commons, and what steps can be taken to reduce the number of people that consume violent and what we call lawful but awful content online, and then are driven towards acts of violence pursuant to that radicalization process.
Well, thanks. That gives me a great opportunity to bring Stephanie Carvin into the conversation. Stephanie, you've been researching and thinking and writing about these issues as it relates to Canadian national security throughout your career. Can you talk to us about where do you see the trend in violent extremism in Canada going? And can you put into context for our audience the events in Ottawa in February of 2022, or what's known as the Trucker Convoy or the Freedom Convoy? How does that fit into this picture? Leslie Soper gave a couple different examples of violent activity, but one of the things that we all saw were these was the Freedom Convoy. So can you kind of put that in context for us?
Sure. And I just want to thank you so much for having me here today and being on this great panel. I do want to start by saying, Leslie started off was describing one of the incidents that happened. The London attack was 2 years ago today. It killed a Muslim family, 4 members of a Muslim family, one critically injured survivor. And it was just an awful attack with vehicles, and very much inspired by the transnational ideologies that we're talking about. But I think that to your point, one of the things that I think we're trying to grapple with is when it comes to tools and mechanisms is that a lot of the things that we're seeing in Canada, where does it fit? And the convoy is a good example of this, right? So it kind of falls into what I think we're seeing our authorities describe as ideologically motivated violent criminality. Right. So things that might fall below the threshold of national security, but there is that connection to national security threats, usually through that ideology. So only a small number of people might actually be engaging in violent extremism, but kind of swimming in that pool of that ideologically motivated violent criminality that we saw on the convoy. So getting to the convoy, that was a whole thing, to put it mildly, but it didn't come out of nowhere, right? It's something that I think we saw build in Canada, and this might tell a useful story for the audience in terms of our connections transnationally and some of the ideas that I think informed that movement. Form might be the wrong word, but you get my drift. So really the origins of that movement go back to 2014, 2015, when we started seeing large numbers of refugees coming to Syria, and simultaneously the rise of the alt-right, which was inspired really by 2 different movements. First of all, the kind of European, they have Pegida, the Patriotic Europeans Against Islamization of the West. That's the acronym's Pegida. And we saw chapters show up here in Canada. We saw chapters of the Soldiers of Odin, which was a Finnish far-right movement, show up as well. So there is definitely that kind of European connection. And at the same time, we also started to see, with all respect, the candidacy of Donald Trump, who normalized hate speech in a way that I think hadn't really been kind of platformed or normalized before. And that had an almost immediate effect, I think, not just in the United States, but also in Canada as well. And what we saw then was this kind of anti-immigration movement that kind of was rooted in Leslie talked about the way we think about IMVE. We talk about it through xenophobia. We talk about it through gender-based violence, but also through anti-authority movements. And I think that this kind of grievance pot, if you will, has constantly tried to reframe its grievances over different things. So it went up against, for example, there was the Yellow Vest movement in France, which was about the cost of living, got taken up by kind of far-right extremists. Sorry, my dog has views on this apparently because someone's at my door. Max, sorry. Okay, there's nothing I can do, but my dog has been radicalized. My apologies.
All right, well, I'm going to pause you there for a second.
Just to finish up, it went basically from, we saw the kind of yellow vest movement get hijacked in Canada, which turned into an anti-globalization movement, which became part of the anti-lockdown movement, which then became the convoy, right? These guys are always trying to reframe their grievances around something to try and catch public attention. So I apologize for the long answer, and my dog.
No, that's great. Thank you, Stephanie. So I'm going to pick up on a particular, all sorts of things I want to ask you all, but I want to pick up on one thread that you just mentioned, Stephanie, and I'm going to come back to Nick to start with this. You mentioned migration. And I was recently overseas at a conference hosted by the International Institute of Justice that included many European partners, Interpol, Europol, many of our European security partners. And one of the issues that came up amongst that community was the effect of migration, as different parts of the world have experienced it as part of a motivating factor to that type of racial or ethnically motivated violent extremism. Nick, can you weigh in? You're at DHS now, which also has a substantial border security immigration component to its operations, as we all know. Are you seeing any intersection from your perspective on the U.S. side between some of the either mass shootings or acts of violence that we think have this sort of ideological basis that are rooted in anti-migration or that type of influence?
I think you're exactly right, Carrie, because I think one of the things that kind of features in the grievance narratives that both Leslie and Stephanie talked about is this sense that the white community is somehow being shoved aside or supplanted in terms of its preeminence in our society and even globally. And that's happening not because of other white people, that's happening because of brown, black, and yellow people who are migrating to our country. And so that can just be a grievance narrative, or it can be posed in existential terms. And if it's posed in existential terms, then it becomes something that is viewed as an actual threat. And again, if you carry the ideological progression forward in the way that Stephanie was describing, violence ultimately becomes not only justified, but mandated if you're going to defend against this existential threat. And again, this is one of the set of themes I just described is very transnational in nature. You could have the same conversation in a dozen different countries around the world. The particular sources of migration might differ. How much or how fast it's happening might differ, but it's the same underlying narrative. And that's why that narrative has appeal when it travels around the online environment in the way that Leslie was describing.
And Leslie, do you have a thought as well how Public Safety Canada is looking at the intersection between migration issues to the extent that you have them and violent extremism?
Yeah, for sure. I think the xenophobic character of some of the ideological sort of underpinnings for different groups is clearly there, and it presents for us. I think it's the broader social cohesion challenge. I think that we've been looking at. It's equally about. There's a lot of dimensions to this issue. I think there's concern, perhaps, that in the world of social media, that political groups that are interested in dividing political views are overemphasizing issues that undermine social cohesion, which again feeds ideological narratives that are supportive to sort of extremist views. So there's a lot of different fronts, is what I would say, that we need to address issues on. One might be helping prepare Canadians to be more resilient in the face of misinformation that's being communicated to them equally, sort of recognizing what sort of consumption people are engaged in online that is giving rise to radicalization to violence, and getting that into the hands of first responders and medical practitioners and people who are doing frontline social services to sort of identify the types of people that are vulnerable to these types of ideologies. At the end of the day, it's a really problematic issue, I think, for both our jurisdictions in the sense of, the lawful but awful is a very challenging space to regulate, to control in any way without, running contrary to our freedoms and liberties, which in Canada are enshrined through the Charter. And so there's been much thought to how we can work across civil society to engage in questions around resilience in that space. We've always had a very strong push, as has the U.S., on integration for incoming groups into Canadian society. I think that more needs to be done in that space to sort of build whole of society acceptance around levels of immigration within our societies. So these aren't disconnected issues. There is sort of a whole of government, whole of society sort of responses that really will help in that very specific pointy battle that we're taking in the countering violent extremism space.
So I appreciate you, Leslie, bringing into sort of the societal piece of it and the interactions that government, you're in a government role, Nick is in a government role, interaction that governments have with communities, because it actually gives me an opportunity to press both Nick and Stephanie a little bit on some comments that they've made with respect to the different approach that governments might take as they're looking at this current iteration of violent extremism. And let me just unpack explain a little bit what I'm getting at, and then I'm going to come maybe to Stephanie first and then to Nick. One of the things that I've heard both of you talk about is the need for, I think Stephanie has put this as the need for less of a security frame in addressing the current challenges. And I think the word that you've used, Stephanie, in your writing and speaking has been that we need less of a security frame and more of an empathy frame. Nick, in some comments, I think you were maybe at GW. I heard you talk a little bit about the outreach that you and your colleagues are doing with communities, and that the U.S. national security and homeland security establishment is moving away from the CVE, or the countering violent extremism framework, to more of, I'll let you describe it, but more of an engagement. But it's a different approach. It sounds a little bit softer to me. It sounds more collaborative with communities. And I want to push both of you on it a little bit, because as an old counterterrorism lawyer myself of the prior generation of terrorism threats, when we were talking about the Al-Qaeda threat, we were talking about the ISIS threat, we certainly weren't talking, and when I say we, from the U.S. government perspective, we weren't talking about empathy, and we weren't talking about understanding and community. So Stephanie, I'm going to come to you first. Why, in this context, when we're looking at this different nature of domestic radicalization that then leads to potentially violence, why is empathy the path as opposed to more of a just collect intelligence, investigate, disrupt, and try to cut off those particular activities?
So, I think a lot of the solutions put forward in all kinds of counterterrorism, old and the new, if we want to use those terms, and I think we can, not just with like far right, but like really kind of empathy with victims, empathy with communities who have these people in their midst, and trying to figure out and not demonizing them in certain ways. Certainly that with the case with, say, Al-Qaeda or what we call in Canada Daesh, or Islamic state-inspired extremism. But in this context, it's interesting because, the convoy came out and there were legitimate grievances in that movement, right? I mean, Canada, unlike the United States, underwent severe lockdowns, right? We were on like lockdown number 4, I think, at that point. I mean, I remember by February 2022, I just wanted to buy running shoes. I was just desperate to buy running shoes. I mean, all our malls were still closed. So, I mean, there were people who were suffering, who were hard hit up by what was going on. And I think, first of all, trying to understand, like drawing lines between, okay, well, what is, where can we like draw some kind of understanding, but like things like, white replacement theory is not really the kind of thing you can necessarily have empathy with. So being careful with that. But I think also the kinds of remedies, and Canada in some ways does have different remedies. We have something called peace bonds, which are kind of a halfway house between an arrest and doing nothing. It's basically a kind of restraining order, really, that requires an individual to do certain things like go to therapy, stay off the internet, do these kinds of tactics, which I think are very useful in the Canadian space. They are not unproblematic legally, but as a tool, they have been pretty useful. And the other thing we've spent a lot of money and time on are these kind of I would call them de-radicalization centers. I mean, Leslie, you probably have the better term for them than I do, but we have these kind of circles, these centers that have been set up in several provinces that focus on kind of a holistic approach that can also be individualized for people who enter these programs to try and get them to at least disengage from these kind of violent movements. And I've been doing interviews with my colleague, Amarnath Singham. These centers were originally set up for Al-Qaeda and Islamic State-inspired extremism. They're now at least minimum 75% ideologically motivated violent extremism individuals. And the idea is to try and help find them pathways out of this to get if they need mental health care, they can get the mental health care. If they need career coaching, they can get jobs. If they need, just to kind of get their lives together, these have been very useful. And I think that Canada has actually put forward a pretty good model. I think we need more of them. And certainly it's not going to solve everything, but there are certain tools in the toolkit that I think are useful. And the last thing I would put out there is, there are a number of good community organizations that are doing work in this space, whether it's helping affected communities find resilience, challenging these kind of views on the ground and things like this. So it's not all law enforcement, it's not all government. Sometimes it's just doing homework and trying to figure out, okay, who's already in the community, who has a good idea and feel of what's happening, and how can we empower that community group to do more on the ground to help, provide better safe spaces, or express empathy. And when these kind of incidents happen, and the last thing I'll say, sorry, Barbara Perry, who's at University Ontario.
Ontario Tech University.
Ontario Tech University. Changing the name. I'm sorry. She actually wrote, she did research, and she found one of the most effective things that you can do when these attacks happen is large shows of solidarity, meaningful shows of solidarity around victims to show that, these are our norms, these are our values, and help make the communities feel safe. That's another empathy thing that I think we can do to try and counter this.
Okay, great. Well, that's a helpful explanation. Nick, let me come to you.
Sure.
As you know, when we were fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS, we definitely were not interested in creating safe spaces. So help me understand how, from a security perspective, you are reorienting the U.S. government's approach to deal with this different type of domestic threat.
So 2 points. First of all, I don't think there will ever not be a place for strong, good intelligence work and strong, good law enforcement work in helping us deal with threats posed by any form of violent extremism, the current forms of domestic violent extremism we're seeing, or the earlier phases tied, Carrie, as you suggest, to Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. I would argue that the evolution in our approach on prevention, some of which Leslie talked about a minute ago, is not tied to the particular phase of where we are in the fight against terrorism or extremism. It's tied to just lessons learned, and we've learned what works better and what doesn't work so well. And what we've learned doesn't work so well is when you come to communities and say to them, we're really concerned about you because your young people are the problem, and your young people are at risk, and your young people need our help to make sure they don't become extremists or terrorists. There's no way to do that conversation, Carrie, without securitizing it, without making it seem like you're there with your badge in hand, trying to make sure that someone doesn't violate the law or catch somebody if they have violated the law. The alternative approach is to approach communities from a perspective that says there are risk factors that affect every community or that are present in every community. How do we build on the protective strength factors that exist in your community so that young people in your community are more resilient, to use the phrase that Leslie used earlier, are more resilient to these influences, whether in the online space or from peer groups or from other places. And we can find pathways to not disrupt, but to off-ramp or get somebody off of a path that might ultimately lead to a violent outcome. If that happens without law enforcement ever being involved, we're all better off, way better off. Now, to do that, to deliver that outcome, though, you need a wide-ranging set of disciplines involved. You need the mental health profession, you need the social services profession, you need educators, you need faith leaders. I could go on and on and on. That is a whole of society, again, to steal Leslie's term, a whole of society problem. It's also hard to measure effectiveness in this space. You don't know how many people you prevented from going down this path, but from my perspective, it's the only pathway that really, really gives us any hope of blunting these extremist forces. If you engage with communities in their own spaces, on their own terms, and treating them as partners rather than as suspect communities.
Okay, I appreciate that, Nick. It's hard to believe we have just a few minutes left. I want to come to Leslie if you want to weigh in on that. And then also I'm going to come back to each of you just for a final thought, picking up on some themes that Leslie was describing earlier. We've been talking about the role of government, and government obviously has a substantial role here, but the role of the technology community, communications platforms, tech platforms, social media is also integral in being able to identify and neutralize some of these threats. So Leslie, let me come to you if you have a follow-up on that, but also from your perspective, if there was a thing that still needs to be done to improve the coordination or collaboration with the communications companies to counter radicalization to violence, what would it be?
Sure. First I'll pick up on the last point. I think that it is an evolution. There's been a lot of investment in the prevention space, certainly since the heat of the foreign ISIL fighter phenomenon of the early 2010s. And we learned a lot from the errors of that. I mean, a lot of young people went off to their demise in northeastern Syria, and the more that we could have prevented, I think, would have been, would have saved a lot of heartache in many families across North America. So I think it's the lessons from that about how we work with communities to get ahead of these issues is quite important. I cannot overemphasize the importance of technology in this space. There is an accountability here. I think the post Christchurch, the call, the work that's going on through various mechanisms to engage tech companies. We haven't made the inroads past some of the key Western-held platforms to really break the back of slowing down the circulation of terrorist content online that are really continuing to drive radicalization online. There's more work that certainly needs to be done there. It's a perennial call, certainly from the Canadian side, with many folks across our like-minded countries trying to continue to make inroads in that space. There is a shared accountability there that needs to be taken up with a little more fervor by technology platforms.
Nick, do you have, we've got about a minute left. Nick, do you have a final thought? You've sat in a couple different capacities, including your nonprofit service focusing on the technology side. If there was a thing that you see in the near term that could be done that would help the coordination? Is there some particular aspect that you think we need to be focused on the most?
I guess short answer is I don't see a thing. I see, as Leslie suggested, a need for a more constant and deeper dialogue about how to make those platforms contributors to social cohesion rather than kind of echo chambers that grab onto our worst impulses and drive us into all of our respective camps ideologically. And I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to deliver that outcome. I certainly don't know how to deliver that outcome consistent with a freedom of speech framework and a respect for rights framework that we share across all of our Western democracies. But we don't get there by not talking about it. So I say we keep working at it.
Great. Well, we're going to end on that note. Leslie Soper from Public Safety Canada, Stephanie Carvin from Carleton University, and Nick Rasmussen now at DHS. Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your knowledge and your expertise and your experience with our CNAS audience today. For those of you who have been following along to the CNAS conference, for our last session of day one, please join us at 3:20 p.m. Eastern for a conversation between Emily Kilcrease, the director of our Energy, Economics, and Security program here at CNAS, and Grant Harris, the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Industry and Analysis on the Biden administration's economic security agenda. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.